on the panel, we have Pedro Noguera. He is a education professor, people can clap, at New York University. Michael Mulgrew is the president of the United Federation of Teachers and was a teacher for 12 years. And Juan Gonzales is a columnist for the Daily News and co-host of Democracy Now! On WBAI. The conference today obviously happens in terms of, while the Democrats have taken the White House and the Congress, there is a sense that education in this country has not taken a progressive turn. And so that's what we're going to try to deal with on this panel, and specifically in New York City. So just to begin, I'm going to ask the panelists to say if they believe, if there's something that they can say that they think has actually improved under Bloomberg in the system, which they should think about. And also, if they can talk about the thing that they think has gone down or gone bad, the most troublesome thing that has gotten worse in the last 8 years.
First, you can go first.
There's 2 mics here.
Okay, good morning. I have to say, because I'm in schools throughout New York City a lot, that I think a lot has improved in New York City. Because I go to lots of schools, and I see lots of schools that are doing better. I see lots of schools that are focused on learning. I've gotten to schools that have turned around, that are doing a better job now than they were a few years ago. I was at Hillcrest High Schools in Queens on Thursday. They're doing an excellent job with 3,200 kids. So I have to say, even though I am most often very critical of what's happening in New York City, I have to acknowledge improvement where I've seen it. That doesn't mean that I think everything's better. In fact, I think there's a highly punitive culture. I think that this attempt at closing schools is a sign of a system that blames the educators and doesn't regard what happens to children as a consequence of what they're doing. I'm writing an op-ed that'll come out this week called Designed to Fail, because I believe that those schools that they're trying to close and now are going to be closed, because who wants to go to a school that's been designated as a closing school, were in fact designed to fail, because they overloaded them and they over-concentrated them with the high-need kids. So I could go on with the critique, but I have to also say I go to lots of schools that are doing a great job. Now, I often say I think they're doing a good job because of the people who are there, not necessarily because of the help they get from the DOE. Because I don't believe the DOE has a help strategy for schools. They have a closing strategy for schools. They have a threatening strategy for schools. But in spite of that, there are schools that are thriving. And I have to acknowledge that that's occurring right now in New York City.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's having a nice day so far. Let's see. We should start on the negative and finish on the positive, right? It's teacher. Sorry. On the negative, I have a very, very difficult time with what this administration has done with completely closing the community out of the educational discussion. I think it's a huge mistake what they've done. I believe that schools are stronger when the community around the school is actually engaged in a meaningful manner, and it's something that we have a complete disagreement with this current administration on. The focus on standardized testing as being the only benchmark is something that is going to actually destroy a lot of children's lives, I believe, in the long run. So those are 2 of the things that trouble me the most in the system. On the positive side, the ability for schools to go out on their own and try to figure it out, I think has been sort of something that they did not plan in terms of teachers. And I have been in schools, as you said, Pedro, that really have decided to go out on their own and try to fix things. And that's been a positive, but I don't think it is something that they planned. It's easier to get people on payroll now, much faster. I'm trying to be positive. And up till about this year, it was easy to get supplies for about a 4-year period. So I will give those as positives, okay? Thank you.
Good morning. As a columnist, I get the privilege to not only try to report the information, but to try to give my take on what is actually happening. That's what I will do today. There's definitely been some positive stuff that's happened in the last few years, not necessarily as a result directly of the policies of the current administration. First of all, the biggest was the final resolution of the Campaign for Equity's lawsuit, which allowed huge infusions of money that were long due to the New York public school systems to come in, and has now permitted huge new amounts of capital investment. The mayor rarely talks about the huge increases in the education budget that have resulted in the last few years as part of that lawsuit. The other positive aspect that's happened is that as the American cities are being re-engineered, and as the middle and upper classes are moving back into the central cities from the far-off suburbs, there is an increasing attention to public education by those middle and upper classes, because our city is now, not just New York, but all the major cities in America are being redesigned along the European model, where the poor and the working class are being thrust out into the far reaches in the suburban areas, and the middle and upper classes are moving back into the central cities. So that they now have a more need for better education in the public schools, and the mayor is in essence carrying out that policy of trying to devote greater attention to public education as the economic mix of the city changes. So I think that that's a positive sense, because all the working class and poor that's still in the city will to some degree or other benefit by the new attention that the upper classes are giving to public education that they didn't give in the past. On the other hand, I think there has been an enormous assault on the democratic nature of public education. Later on if we talk, I'll get into some of the specifics. An incredible assault on the democratic nature of public education. My wife worked for many years as a high school teacher at Boys and Girls High, and then she decided after about 10, 12 years that she wanted to change, and she moved out and is now teaching in the NYU high school system. And she tells me every night that she cannot believe the difference between how the parents of the Nyack district run their district, that the principals and the teachers and everyone lives in fear of the parents, compared to Boys and Girls High, which was a completely different situation in terms of parent involvement. So that in reality, throughout America, in the suburbs of America, the public schools work fine. In the rural areas, they work fine, and the parents have an enormous voice and investment and say in how the schools are run. But in the last 10 or 15 years, what has happened in the cities is one by one in all the major cities, mayoral control and domination by the local officials over the parents of the schools has occurred. So that you have two public school systems. You have the public school systems of the suburbs and rural America and the small cities, and then you have the public school systems of the big cities, where there is no democracy, where there's total control by those who are in charge. And I think that's an assault to democracy that then leaves open corruption in all kinds of ways. And I think that fundamentally this is also changing the way that the kind of education, because our children, yes, are doing better in terms of passing tests, but they're doing worse, from what I can tell, in terms of critical thinking and understanding of the world around them, and being able to use their education to challenge what is going on. So they're not being taught to be democratic thinkers. They're being taught to be obedient thinkers. And I think that that's a fundamental negative of what's happening in our city.
So maybe we can go into that a little bit further. If you guys can talk some about what standardized testing and the increase of it nationally, but also specifically in New York City, has done to education. Has there been any way in which that's benefited children? And if not, can you talk sort of more specifically about what you think it's done to education?
What I try to remind people often is that assessment is just a tool. It's a tool that we can use to monitor what kids are learning. It's a tool that we can use to get a sense of whether or not what we're doing is working. But kids don't get any smarter by testing them. Schools don't improve because you use testing in this way. And what's happened is because policymakers like testing a lot. It gives them a way to monitor. It's like the stock market, right? So they get a chance to see whether or not things are moving. But educators who know that there's a lot more involved than merely preparing kids for tests to ensure that they're getting the kind of education that Juan described, understand there's got to be a lot more there. What we've seen in many schools, and we have to be very clear, it's particularly in schools that serve poor children, is a highly prescriptive curriculum that focuses narrowly on test preparation. And increasingly, anything that's not on the test gets taken away from children. So if art and music's not on the test, art and music's off the curriculum. Recess is definitely not on the test. So you see schools taking away recess at a time when obesity is the number one health challenge facing poor children, especially in this country. I saw a study the other day that said that eating lunch was good for test scores. I said, thank God. Or they might take lunch too. Because this approach to focusing so narrowly on the test, as Mike said, is what's driving now this interest in performance pay for teachers. And if we move in that direction, we will see this emphasis on test preparation go even further. Let me just describe, I was doing research in Boston on high schools a few years back, trying to understand why some high schools were getting better and others weren't. Went to one big high school that was actually the school they used to make the TV story Boston Public, was based on this particular school. And this is at a time when Massachusetts had implemented their high-stakes exam. If you didn't pass this exam, you were denied a diploma. And this was a high school where over 50% of the seniors had failed the exam twice. So we went into the schools, and we go into the classrooms, and what do we find? We find kids in double-period math, double-period literacy, all test prep. And you open the door, and what are kids doing? They're playing cards and putting on makeup. Because although there's this emphasis, the facade of being serious now, in fact, there's no quality control, no focus on whether or not the kids are actually learning. And we try to explain to both the administrator of that school and to the Boston Public Schools, said, look, many of these kids aren't reading. Test prep won't make up for kids who don't read. If they haven't been exposed to the math, Kaplan won't help them pass the math exam, which required exposure to algebra, geometry, and some of Algebra 2. And the principal of that particular school said, I know. He said, but I don't know what to do. I said, but what you've got to do is find a way to improve the instruction. He said, that's too much for us. We've got to get these kids to pass the test. Then he said, you know what our biggest problem at this school is? He said, our biggest problem is that we have 17 doors. I said, 17 doors? He said, that's right. There's so many ways that they can escape. We have to keep someone at every door all day long. I said, you ever wonder why they want to escape from this place? We're asking the wrong questions. We're focused on the wrong things. And in some ways, because of this distorted use of the test, we've allowed test preparation to now take the place of a well-rounded education for kids. And so I think this is one of the areas that we've got to begin to push back on in a big way. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge the world for testing, before testing, was not necessarily a good world either. There were lots of kids going through school. If they were well-behaved and came relatively often, they could get a degree and end up functionally literate with a high school diploma. So we've got to also say, well, where we want real evidence that kids are learning. What constitutes legitimate evidence that kids have actually learned and are prepared for what's next?
I'm going to try to keep this short. I can speak on this for about 8 hours. We if we don't stop the emphasis on testing, I understand that testing has to be there. Some of the younger members of the UFT think that George Bush invented testing. And I tell them, no, Socrates gave tests a couple of thousand years ago. So we know how to use them. But we're so far out of balance. I was in a school 2 weeks ago where the entire curriculum was based upon skill sets that are needed to perform on a standardized test. And that's what the entire curriculum for this class was. It had nothing to do with learning. So we are training children to pass standardized tests. And the schools, you talk to the administrators, they said, that's what my livelihood and my profession is now based upon, that performance on that test of the children in this school. So what else would you have me do? I say, take a chance. Take the chance. It's much easier to acquire knowledge for a child if you take knowledge and embed it into an enriched curriculum that will engage the student. And that's where we have to get back to. We have to recognize what the standards and what children need to know, and then embed it inside of an enriched curriculum about real learning, not inside of a curriculum about passing a test. And it's so frustrating right now because you see this taking control of so many different places in this city. And then the issue that I see is the tests themselves being the sole measurement is a very, very disturbing issue because we see so many people now gaming the system. Look what we do here in New York. New York City, state test results come out, the chancellor cheers. NAEP test results come out. What's with the 25-point discrepancy? Look at Florida. That's the state, the king of testing. They have a 65-point discrepancy between the NAEP scores and their state test scores. If that's not the clearest evidence to say this isn't working, and people don't want to deal with that issue, we bring it up now more and more. And this is the part where the community has to start speaking about this. The city NAEP scores for ELA will be coming out shortly, supposedly, if the state gets it finished. And I know what it's going to show. Flat, at best. Flat. So as we're sitting here and people celebrate that children now are learning more because of the state test scores, we look at the NAEP and it's showing us there's no learning. We look at the fact that now that close to 75% of the students who graduate New York City high schools need remediation when they go to CUNY. So it's telling us we're not teaching them, they are not learning, they are being trained. And that's the biggest disturbing part that I see, because as a teacher, you can prep for a test. But if that becomes all that you want teachers to do, you're basically telling us just train children to do something that won't work for them. And when I look at high schools, we got rid of social promotion. Remember that debate, the social promotion debate? So we got rid of social promotion. So how come I can walk into a high school where 80% of the kids all pass their standardized test, but they're on level 1? They're level 1. So don't tell me we're not gaming ourselves and fooling ourselves as a city. And we need to really have a very serious discussion, because it's going to take a lot of will to push them off of this agenda, because they do not know how to measure anything else. They were not inside of classrooms. The people who are making these decisions have never been educators, and that's why they struggle, because they just don't understand what it really takes to teach a child and for a child to learn what is going to allow them to have the life that we want them to have.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this except to say that, again, to get back to my theme of the growing corruption, the corruption, the testing process, to me is mind-boggling. Again, as Mike has said, year after year, the NAEP shows a very different result from many of these states. And in New York, the corruption process is rampant. And it's not just New York City, obviously. The state has to be a participant in the process as well. But not only are the cut scores lowered, they're being lowered while the tests themselves have been in the field tests that the state has done, the tests themselves have gotten easier while the cut scores are being lowered, which should be the other way around. If the test is getting easier, is demonstrated to be easier, then the cut score should be raised if you're going to continue to compare it to past tests. So the credit recovery scandal in high school to help improve the graduation rates. There are so many ways that the entire process of demonstrating through data that there is improvement has been corrupted. And there is no one independently checking the claims of the state or the city in terms of the progress just on the testing. The bonuses offered to principals and to teachers to be able to show these kind of results in their individual schools. The attempt to give money to kids so that they could, which has turned out to be a disaster. They've corrupted the entire process of trying to use testing as a means of being able to determine whether there is progress in the system.
Okay, she's got to ask the question.
Okay, so we have a question from the floor that is, do you believe the charter school movement is an effort to privatize the public schools? And I would just add that in talking to Joel Klein and in his press conferences, he often talks about gaining market share, specifically in Harlem, meaning the density of the charters, that is that they have a certain percentage of, they educate a certain percentage of the children in a particular neighborhood. So could you also address the issue of density, whether or not you think that's a problem, and if you think charters themselves are a problem or can be part of the solution? And maybe we'll start with Juan.
Yeah, well, as those of you who read the Daily News regularly, and I don't blame many of you if you don't, but those of you who do, know that that I've spent a lot of time trying to look at charter schools, because I'm a product of the New York public school system. And I'm very familiar with the histories of the battles. I had a conversation with Eva Moskowitz once when she tried to tell me a story about how she grew up in Harlem. And I said, oh yeah, I said, Miss Moskowitz, I grew up in Harlem too. What part of Harlem did you grow up in? And because I grew up on East 112th Street. And she says, oh, I grew up on 118th Street. I said, oh yeah, is that in the East 118, or Central 118 or the West? And she said, no, 118 in Amsterdam. I said, oh, you grew up on Morningside Heights. And it turns out her father was a professor at Columbia, and that's where she grew up. But she keeps telling everyone she grew up in Harlem. But my point on the charter schools is that I think that what is happening is the charter schools are replacing the old Catholic schools. They are the new second-class system. There's a first-class education system, and now instead of coach, you're getting second-class and third-class. And the charter schools are becoming the second-class system for the upwardly mobile working class, specifically African-American. There are very few Latinos that are being recruited into the charter schools. And they are creating enormous conflicts in every single community. Parents are fighting each other because the charter schools are a better class system within these communities. I was talking to parents at PS 149, which is one of the early charter schools that Eva Moskowitz's Harlem Success moved into. They told me that the way the school is broken up, the children from the regular public school, because I think it's the auditorium that's in Eva's section, whereas the cafeteria and the library are in the public school section, so that the public school kids, to get to the auditorium, are required to go out of the building into the street and come around through another entrance to get into the auditorium because Harlem Success doesn't want them walking through their hallways. Right? They cannot use the bathrooms of Harlem Success. You're creating a segregated system within a public school. Whereas the Harlem Success kids are allowed to walk through the hallways of the public school to get to the common facilities. So the level of segregation of resources, if you're a child in a public school building that also has a charter school, you feel that you are a second-class person within that school system, or within that school. So I think that charter schools are creating enormous conflicts within many Black and Latino communities. The way that they're able to marshal resources from the private sector that public schools cannot, and also I think, again, on the corruption side, you are going to see more corruption out of the charter school system as it grows than anyone ever imagined from the old school decentralization, because it is structured in a way to guarantee corruption. Because, one, the boards of directors of these charter nonprofits are either business people who really don't pay much attention to what's going on, except that they have a particular interest in the land or the building or some aspect of the school, or community folks who are not trained, but they're individually in supposedly the boards of directors of these schools. There's no oversight. The contracting. Who is getting the contracts for the textbooks? Who is getting the contracts for the public relations? Who is doing the staff development? They all decide that on their own, and there is no monitoring from the public schools. So there is no oversight of the charter schools. It's structured to guarantee the flourishing of corruption, and it is already happening, and it will continue to happen, and we're going to see it on big scale in the future.
I always love this question. Do I believe that charter schools are an attempt to privatize? I believe there are those involved with the charter school movement who are trying to privatize public education. Yes. I also know that there are charter schools based upon, developed by community-based organizations, developed by teachers who just said, I want to try something different, who are not trying to privatize public education. They're trying to just have fun and experiment with public education and experiment with education. And those schools I fully support. But I do know that the New York, as far as I'm concerned, and I've said it publicly before, the New York State Charter School Association has one agenda: to privatize and to profit off of public education. And I will continue to say that. When I'm starting, now I have to start learning what's called per pupil back office management fees. Because now I'm hearing of these things because we were working with the staff at a charter school in Queens, and they were broke. And we tried to figure out why, so we tried to help them. And then we found out that they were being charged $1,800 per head for back office per pupil management fees. I said, what is that? They said, well, it's management fees. I said, well, do they come in? Do they program the building? They said, no, they just do all the paperwork for the building. They do the ordering. They do the... I said, they're charging $1,800 a student. I said, that's 20% of their budget. I said, as far as I'm concerned, I know we have not-for-profit status for charter schools in New York State, even though not-for-profit really doesn't mean much anymore now that we have not-for-profit entrepreneurship is alive and well. But they said they're allowed to offer to have for-profit management companies. And then we find out that there are people on the boards of these charter schools who are actually part of the for-profit management companies. And $1,800 sounded like an awful lot of money, especially since the school now is telling us they can't get textbooks. So then we start looking at this throughout the state. We found one in Buffalo, $5,000 per child's head for back office management fees. And all of these people somehow tie back to the Charter School Association. Now, I believe that everyone has the best interest of children at heart, but when I see people on an association that has to do with education, and two of them were former Walmart executives, two of them were hedge fund managers, and two of them worked for a very, very conservative elected official, I don't know if their interest is really about children. And I start to question what they're doing. And when we offered for changes in the charter school law, when we put together and we helped, we asked for transparency. They didn't want that. Who's against transparency? We don't want to show you what we're doing. You don't want transparency. We said you shouldn't have for-profit people running management companies over charter schools because it's just going to lead to corruption and more of it. Oh, no, we got to have for-profit staff. This is what you're fighting for. We also said change the funding formula so dollar for dollar follows the child, which would be a good thing for all schools. They said, we're not going to fight for that. We're going to fight you tooth and nail on that for-profit status thing. So when I see clear examples of what people's intentions are, then I have a right, and I believe it is my obligation and responsibility to speak out against it. So are there some people there who are trying to privatize and to make a profit off children by using charter schools? Yes. Are there some people who are trying to do the right thing, to experiment, to try to do new things in education and share what they learn? Yes. And we must have the distinction between the two. We cannot paint them with a broad brush. Thank you.
So, like Mike, I also have a fairly complex perspective on charter schools. And the first thing I have to do is let you know I'm a trustee for the State University of New York. I chair the Committee on Charter Schools, and we authorize charter schools. Okay? We voted 3 weeks ago to shut down a charter school in Albany that was run by one of these for-profit corporations. At the same time, when you look at several of our charter schools, a school like Excellence Charter School in Bed-Stuy, anybody who would argue with me that those kids don't deserve that, I would say, has never visited that school. Let's be clear and fair about it. There are public schools throughout New York City that screen kids. My son goes to one. He goes to Beacon School. Stuyvesant, let's name them. They all screen kids. How do you think we end up with such racially segregated public schools in New York City? Not much clapping from those of us who are sending our kids to those schools. I was at North Star in Newark, an excellent charter school. I also am working with public schools in Newark. Newark public schools have a 10% absentee rate among teachers every day of the week, the highest absentee rate in the state of New Jersey. You go to Newark public schools, the traditional public schools, and you see the disorganization and the dysfunction that's characterized that system. Then you go to North Star, and you see the same population of kids. Now, I think Juan is right. They're not always the same. Right? That sometimes there are slight differences. The families that were able to get to the lottery, that were that motivated, they're not the same as the families that didn't even know there's a lottery. But are we going to say that those poor black kids at North Star don't deserve that? The kids in the rest of the system deserve better than they're getting right now. And we cannot defend dysfunctional schools that don't work. I can't defend it. When I visited North Star, I left thinking, you know what this reminds me of? After slavery ended, white missionaries from the North went to the South to open up schools for the former slaves. They were paternalistic. They emphasized training blacks for menial jobs, but nobody else was stepping up to educate black people at that time. Many of the historically black colleges were, in fact, started by those same people, including former Union generals. Who's stepping up to educate the kids of the inner city right now and say, we're going to do a better job? In some cases, it is the charter schools. Not all, and I think Mike is right. Some of them are there. Some of Eva's schools have come up. I look at the board. It's all hedge fund managers. I said, does anybody here live in Harlem? Have you talked to anybody that lives in Harlem? This is a huge problem. The lack of public accountability, the lack of responsiveness to the community, the battles that Mike is raising are the battles we've got to fight for. I'm seeing schools right now, charter schools that are going into good public schools, right here at PS 188, and displacing a good public school because they want to bring in girls prep, most of which are not kids from the Lower East Side. So I think we have to have a more nuanced view of what's going on out there. We can't take a broad brush and say all charters are bad or all charters are good. They're a mixed bag out there. But at the same time, we do have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do to make sure that kids are not relegated to an inferior education because of our blind support of a system that's not working for them?
So maybe that's a good place to move into a question from the floor that says, what happened to Brown versus the Board of Education? And could you comment on the state of integration? Because it seems like, and if you guys can address this, that there's not just a difference of perception, there's a difference of facts. Charter schools are not as poor as the rest of the public schools in the city. Some charter schools do better, some charter schools do worse. Joel Klein is often quoted as saying that the achievement gap has shrunk in the city under him. There's a difference of opinion as to whether or not that's true. And he often also says, often when he goes to black churches in particular, he'll say, I'm always told that you won't close the achievement gap until you end poverty, but I'm saying that you won't end poverty until you fix education. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk some about that. About what it would take to close the achievement gap, and also just some facts around whether or not it has closed, that is, whether or not education for black and brown children has improved under Bloomberg.
I love the comment on Joel's quotes. He's very good at misrepresenting. You look at the state standardized tests, he can claim that he's closed the achievement gap. You look at the NAEP tests, you can say that he absolutely has not. But it's not up to an individual to close the achievement gap. That's what we need to understand here. It can't be any one person who's going to close the achievement gap. I think you look at a school just as a teacher looks at as a classroom. First 2 weeks of school in September, the teacher analyzes each and every one of their students, decides what supports and which way they're going to approach each student. And that's how we need to look at schools. There is no boilerplate system that's going to work here. And, you know, from my own experience as a teacher, I taught at-risk for 12 years. I needed different supports than the other classrooms around me because of my students. And I did everything and would fought for anything for my students. But I think we need a system that has that adaptability. I look at community schools. I look at what Jeffrey Canada is doing in Harlem. And I say, that's something we all got to look at. Because he's not just servicing charter schools. He also is servicing 9 public schools. And I go to those 9 public schools as well as his charter schools, and I look. I go to the Children's Aid Society. I said, how do you analyze what a school needs? Because I thought it was all, you put in a health clinic, you put in an extended stay program. And they said, no, we don't do it that way. Each school has unique needs. And I think that's where we need to start moving. I don't understand how a school that has 20% of the children are living in homeless shelters doesn't have extra social workers in it. That just boggles my mind. It's a common sense approach. But we don't have that. So if we're really going to start addressing this, because the achievement gap is there. And I don't want to be I would hope that this, as a society, we're not discussing this in 15 years. Because if we are, that means we have all woefully failed. And it is all of our responsibility. So when I look at things that, what can we do to really make a difference? I know the standardized test approach, just standardized test approach, is not going to make the difference. But I also know that schools need to be able to customize the supports around them. So in terms of creating community schools with adaptability, with extended time, with integrated curriculum, with being able to say, this school gets more social workers, this school needs a health clinic, this school needs a dental clinic. And then integrating that, break the wall. It can't be just a CBO working after school. The CBO should be part of the integration of the entire school day. And that is something you really don't see. You hear about it when you walk into a school. They say, of course we have that. You go in and in practice, it's not there in most cases. And I'm looking very hard. We have a whole team working on a project where we can start to do this, to come up with a way where each school, we get to look at what their needs are. And then the other piece that's very disturbing to me here in New York City is we think that once a child is proficient, our responsibility is over. Could you imagine we now have a system where we want the children to be proficient? What parent wants to hear, your child is now proficient, you're good? What has gone on with gifted and talented here in the city? What has gone on with expanding education? We can't just be about trying to get this low bar anymore, the proficient child. So if we just give the supports so we can move education forward, but more importantly, start saying that our job is to make sure that every child can reach their full potential and then push them even further. If we take that approach rather than we're going to make them all proficient, I think that will really start to help with the achievement gap, because it's becoming very frustrating, very, very frustrating. And I think we're going backwards with the sole criteria now is their performance on a standardized test.
I didn't finish my analogy before between Reconstruction and charter schools. The other thing that struck me about North Star is all the staff is white. None of them are from Newark. Okay? Maybe some are from Newark, but not where the kids are from. Same time, they're providing more good education. Now, they also have those kids marching in the hallway. They silence in the hallway, silence in the lunchroom. Now, a lot of things I saw at the school disturbed me, right? And I challenged a lot of times these charter providers about this regimented education that they're giving to the kids. Because I said, I've never gone to a prep school where kids have to be silent in the hallway. Right? And if you were really thinking about preparing these kids to be leaders, leaders get to talk in the hallway too, right? So, going back to why I think I have a complex view. At the same time, when you go to a disorganized school where kids are fighting all over the place, you say, well, God, this is a lot better than that. Right? And a lot of times that's the choice in a place like Newark, not a prep school. Joel Klein keeps saying education is a civil rights issue of the 21st century, but this is the only civil rights issue where integration is not part of that conversation. And I told him the other day, I said, schools will end up more segregated under you and Bloomberg than they were before, okay? 7 African-American students will be admitted to Stuyvesant this fall. There are less than 300 kids from the Bronx at Bronx Science, okay? But many of us here are implicated. If you have kids in New York City, you're probably implicated in this segregation too. Because middle-class people are not putting their kids in schools with poor kids in New York City for the most part. The Village Voice had that article, blacks in the back door, whites in the front door. A lot of liberal white folks from the Upper East Side got pissed at me when I said this is a blatant example of institutionalized racism that's rampant throughout New York City, including a great liberal champion, Patrick Sullivan, who kept telling me, no, this is not true. I said, look at the facts. With this deep denial here on all levels about the way we're using gifted and talented programs to screen out. I went to Hunter College had this, Hunter College K-12 school. They went to the In the Heights was showing, I went the same day they went, because the director, producer, lead actor of In the Heights is Lin-Manuel Miranda. He's a graduate of Hunter. And they wanted to go see one of theirs out there performing. And afterwards, they stayed around, and he took their questions. And they were so proud of him because what a talented person this guy is. He's, Tony Awards. But there was not a single kid from Washington Heights at Hunter anymore. Right? What happened? No more talent, no more gifted children in Hunter? In Washington Heights or in Harlem or in East New York? What's going on here? This deep segregation in the schools is about race and class. And Klein keeps arguing it's not about poverty. Okay? not about poverty. The same week, he had an op-ed that came out in the paper this week that's not about poverty, it's about teaching. Same week it came out, a study showed when a family loses the job, kids' scores in school or performance in school usually dips between 15 and 20%. That same year, the family loses the job. Another study this week came out, kids with chronic asthma have missed between 30 and 40 days of school a year. We have kids with chronic asthma throughout New York City. This idea that poverty is not an educational issue is such a distortion of the facts. Only people could say that are people who don't get close to the children. Okay? So we've got to address the fact that, first of all, the achievement gap is about inequality. It's about inequality in children's backgrounds, but it's also about inequality in their access to good schools. And those of us who support screen schools, those of us who support the idea of Frank McCourt School going into Brandeis, right? The phase-out school. So think about the cruelty here. They're phasing out Brandeis, supposedly to get a better school for those kids, except now they're putting in Frank McCourt School, which is not for those kids. It's for the kids in the Upper West Side. Right? It's supposed to be another beacon. Right? So what's really happening here is a concentration of the neediest kids into the worst schools. And those are the schools that they're going to keep saying are failing, and we're going to shut them down, which is just another shell game for moving kids around the city.
Yeah, the achievement gap. I want to tell you a little story about, I've had some sit-downs with Joel Klein, and he's given me his story about how this is a civil rights question of the 21st century and how committed he is to it. I wrote an article about a year and a half ago about, Klein developed this thing called the Education Equality Project that he and Al Sharpton were the co-chairs of initially, and they went around the country speaking in different places. And then I'd gotten some information that Harold Levy's hedge fund had given, I think it was $500,000, or funneled $500,000 to Sharpton's National Action Network just before he agreed to do this Education Equality Project. He'd actually funneled it through Joe Williams's nonprofit reform group. So I had to ask Sharpton about it. So I had breakfast with him one morning and raised it in the conversation. I said, by the way, Al, is it true that Harold Levy gave you $500,000? And so Sharpton was pretty open about it. He admitted it. And he said it's to organize a conference and, for our staff people. And I said, well, Al, do you know that the Education Equality Project that you are the co-chair of with Joel Klein is incorporated in Delaware? And he said, oh, no, I didn't even know we were incorporated yet. I thought we were still organizing it. I said, no, and it's got a few $1 million in its account. And not only that, there's an Education Equality Project Action Fund, which is a 501c4 that's also incorporated in Delaware. And it's got quite a bit of money in it. Now, here was Al Sharpton, who supposedly was the co-chair with Joel Klein of this, and he had no idea that Klein was raising all this money and setting up all this apparatus without even telling him, his co-chair, about it. There are all kinds of things happening. I believe that what was happening at the time was that Joel Klein was trying to become the new Secretary of Education and was trying to build a national profile, and it didn't work out that way. And so he was trying to establish a national name for himself as well. But I think that I question I'm sure that Klein sincerely believes he's trying to close the achievement gap. But I have a big problem with an approach that leaves out and totally marginalizes the very people that you claim you want to help. I have a problem with a chancellor who promotes charter schools as a major solution when he's in charge of the public schools. So he is urging people to leave his system, right? Because they'll get a better education in the charter schools rather than say, hey, these are the public schools that I'm responsible for. Or a situation where you are guaranteeing that the system that you're in charge in, that the upwardly mobile kids leave that system to go to the charters, and you are left with the limited English learners, the special education, the other children, and then you don't provide them the adequate services that they need, so that you are assuring that your achievement gap, at least for the public schools, won't be closed. It'll close more for the charters and for the kids that go into these other schools. And the other thing is, and I think this is a crucial thing about all these co-locations and closing of schools and small schools, I've talked to the people who do this, the John Whites of the world and the Tarancos and these others of the world. A public school is not just a building. A public school is a key institution in a community. Right? It is part of that community's identity. When you begin shifting kids all over the city, sending them here, sending them there, there's no relationship of the student body of that school to the community in which it's in, and increasingly the parents don't have a connection. You are destroying the neighborhoods and the community's sense of identity. Right? And that there has to be a way to reform public education while keeping neighborhood schools, while keeping a neighborhood built around that school, the kind of situation where the parents take their kids to the school, walk them to school, they all know each other, the kids know each other, and there's a community. Community is being destroyed because this is one of my pet peeves. The public spaces of our cities are being taken away, not just the public schools in the sense that we used to know them, the public parks, all the public spaces are being privatized and reorganized in a way that a sense of community is being lost. So I think that while Klein may espouse closing of the achievement gap, the actual actions that he is taking, in my mind, are disempowering the very communities that he pretends to be so concerned about having them achieve.
Okay, there's so many great questions up here that people sent in, and I'm going to give the ones that were addressed specifically to people to them. I apologize, we're out of time. There are a million more things to discuss, but I think the panelists will at least be around for a few minutes if you want to come and talk to them.